Good morning, and I welcome you to another edition of Now You Know. I'm Chris Perkins, and to my left is David Richards, director of the Margaret Chase Smith Center, and we are standing outside of the Margaret Chase Smith, Center Library, and we're going to go in, and I think we're going to have a fascinating interview, and then we are going to take you on an historical tour through Margaret Chase Smith's life from 1897 to 1970. So stay tuned. It's going to be an interesting show. Good morning, folks. Welcome to another edition of Now You Know, and we're at a really fascinating place here this morning. We're at the Margaret Chase Smith Library, and we're actually in Margaret Chase Smith's living residence in a very lovely living room area. And I've got a lot of history just surrounding me here this morning. But before we do that, I want to introduce David Richards, who is the director at Margaret Chase Smith Library. And you've been the director for how long, David?
Since the beginning of 2012, so I guess it'd be my 11th year now.
Yeah, and you were an assistant director before
Yeah, I've
that.
been here. This is my 26th year overall.
Yeah, and was it Greg Gallant who is the...
Yes.
Yeah, and he is director emeritus. Did I read that?
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Does that allow him to give comments every once in a while?
We had him, in sort of the culmination of his work here, he had been working on a biography of Margaret Chase Smith, which he completed. So we had him come back afterwards and give a talk about his biography about Margaret Chase Smith as part of our springtime annual Main Town meeting. Year. Yeah.
Yes. It's nice to get back to normal, isn't it?
We're slowly inching our way back there. We get more markers all the time about getting back to normal. Maybe the new normal. I don't know we're going to ever be the way we were in March of 2020 before we got sent home for a while.
Because I was used to coming to both your town meetings and the Leek Shaw presentations in the fall, and like every year, and I think it was up through 2019, and then COVID hit, and the world changed dramatically. And
again, that's an area where we see it in that in 2019 was the last year we were able to have a regular in-person main town meeting, and we had 90 people that year. Yeah. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to go back to 90 people because, as you may remember, sometimes we were cramming people in pretty tight.
We were close, yes.
Well, and one year, the year we had both Senator Collins and Senator King, we had like 125 people, which is really cramming in. Again, in our new world, I don't know that we'll be able to pack people in that tightly. So in 2020 and 2021, we had to do the main town meeting virtually. This year we tried to do it as a hybrid, but one of the things we're finding when you offer it as a hybrid, most people are still going to choose the convenience of being at home or in their workplace and just watching it rather than having to come here. So that's the thing, the next step that we're trying to rebuild is get people to come here for events. We're going to do a Leek Shaw lecture probably in December. And partly because of the time of year where you don't know what the weather's going to be like, and partly because our speaker and some of her commitments, she has chosen that she's going to want to do it as a Zoom presentation. Okay. So again, those are things that may be permanently altered, live in-person events.
Could you possibly do something where you have like a live in-person event, but also have a Zoom option too?
Well, that's what we did with the main town meeting. We did have people be on site, but what I'm saying is if you give the hybrid choice of coming on site or staying at home, it was about 3 to 1. There was 3 times more people watching it on Zoom than actually coming to the library.
Okay.
The other way that we're seeing that is with our book group, which actually we are getting people to come back to the book group. So it's the reverse in that case, that we're getting 3 times more people coming to the library than watching it on the Zoom. But we wanted to still keep the Zoom option because one of the things that happen is with Zoom, you can pick up people who can come farther away. So
exactly, yes.
with our Zoom book group, we have people as far away as Alaska participating.
Oh my goodness.
And we don't want to lose that.
And
so
of course, the night it snows or whatever, and the roads are slippery,
Yep.
then that's a perfect thing.
Yes.
Although, do you find this, that the interaction in person seems to, and I found this in some of the meetings that I've had, the interaction in person is still a little bit better than
it's
it would
much,
be over
it's
Zoom.
infinitely better.
Yeah.
On Zoom, you can't pick up on the social cues.
Yes.
So with the book discussion is where you really see it. In a room, we all can tell when it's appropriate to speak,
Yeah.
but when you're out there on the screen, you can't read the room. And the hard part for me trying to facilitate the discussions is you sort of got to be in two places. You got to be in the room, sort of having your antenna up for the people in the room, but you can't forget those people on the screen as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So they have to do a lot more work. They got to do the flailing of the arms
Yeah.
to get my attention. And actually, what we found is that the people sitting close to the TV had to keep reminding me, there's people on the screen who want to contribute.
Yeah,
We're figuring it out.
I've noticed in organizations that I'm in that it can be a good thing too. The meetings actually go a bit faster on Zoom than they would be in person, because people often hold back on some ideas that they have that they in person they might say. So it's just the way of the world.
Yeah, it's not going away, and there is a place for it, but it's different. And we're all still trying to figure out how that works.
Absolutely, absolutely. So here we are. We're kind of surrounded by some really interesting pictures. This is obviously Margaret Chase Smith on the right over here, and
Her sister Evelyn,
oh,
Yeah.
that's her sister Evelyn.
who also lived into her 90s.
Ah, good genes in that family.
Yes, indeed.
Margaret was what, 97?
97,
Passed
yeah.
away.
Yeah.
Now behind us, really fascinating one. There's one with her and Winston Churchill.
Mhm.
And who's the other?
I think it's Anthony Eden. I can never.
I'm putting him on the
remember.
spot here.
Yeah, Anthony Eden. Who I think Anthony Eden was officially the prime minister at the time.
Oh.
Because as you remember, Churchill actually got voted out of office after World War II, and then
That's
came
right.
back in later.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's hard to believe because he's considered such
Yeah,
an
this
amazing
great wartime leader. Yeah.
leader. Yeah. And was it Neville Chamberlain was before?
Who was before, yeah.
Before
Yeah.
him, and he's the one that didn't want to get involved in the war.
Right.
And then
The Munich Agreement. Peace
Munich
in our
Agreement,
time.
yeah. And
Yes.
Churchill came in. He was the right guy for the time.
Yes.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Now, maybe just a second on this is kind of Margaret Chase Smith 101 here. She. And I'm sure there are a lot of young viewers out here that really don't know a lot about Margaret Chase Smith, probably have never visited this fascinating library, which is right on the outskirts of Skowhegan on Norridgewock Avenue. But Margaret Chase Smith ended up starting out in the House, or the House of Representatives, because her husband, Clyde, died. And that was the start of a pretty fascinating career from then on.
She had actually gone down to Washington in 1937. He got elected her husband Clyde got elected to the House of Representatives in 1936, and so got sworn in 1937. And she was his secretary in his office. So she was quite aware of the issues of the day. And then in 1940, he had heart failure, and he knew he was going to die, and he had put out a letter saying he preferred that Margaret succeed him, and she went through the special election and got elected. But since it was 1940, she had to do a special election in June, and then she had to do the regular election in the fall. So she actually had to run twice in 1940, and wound up serving 4 terms in House of Representatives, so 8 years altogether. And then decided in 1948 that she wanted to run for the United States Senate. There was going to be an open seat.
Yeah.
And it was a decision that surprised people because there were 2 very strong candidates running, both men, one the sitting governor of the state of Maine and one a former governor of the state of Maine, Horace Hildreth and Sumner Sewell. And in a 4-way race, she actually won a majority of the vote, which is very hard to do. That's one of the reasons we have ranked choice voting now, is because if you get more than 2 candidates, it's hard to get over 50% of the vote.
Exactly.
And she wound up serving 4 terms in the United States Senate. And early on into her service there, she gave a very famous speech in 1950 called the Declaration of Conscience, which was during the McCarthy era, and that's really what put her on the national stage. President Eisenhower considered her for a vice presidential candidate in 1952. That didn't come about. He chose Richard Nixon instead. And then in 1964, she decided to run for president of the United States. She was the first woman to have her name placed in nomination by one of the two major parties, the Republican Party, in 1964.
Yeah.
So she wound up serving over 30 years in the United States Congress, and as I say, running for president along the way. And many of these things were firsts for women. I always like to point out to students, we have a photo of the Skowhegan High School class in 1916 posed out in front of the White House, and to remind them that in that year, 1916, women still didn't even have the right to vote. Mm-hmm. So it gives you a sense of where she came from. She was really the first woman who was able to take women's right to vote and then to run for office and to turn it into a career.
Yeah. Her Declaration of Conscience speech, that's still one of the, or probably the major event in her life, really.
It's the thing that will keep her in the history books.
Yeah. 1950, Joseph McCarthy, Red Scare.
Yeah.
What type of guts did that take to be the first one to speak out against him?
It took a lot of guts, and there were repercussions to it. McCarthy became very powerful, and he got her removed from some of the committees that she was on. And with other people who stood up against him, he handpicked candidates to run against them, and in some cases those candidates lost their positions. When Margaret had to run again in 1954, he picked a candidate. Margaret very handily defeated him because by 1954 people were starting to catch on to McCarthy, and he was starting to fade in his power. But yeah, she was one of the first to speak out against him, and another indication of how risky it was is that there were very few fellow senators who supported what she said, and they very quickly drifted away. One of the things that undercut her is 3 weeks after she made her speech, the North Koreans invaded South Korea. So for many people, it did look like communism was on the march and trying to take over the world.
Yes. Yeah. Do you see any parallels today to McCarthyism in the 1950s?
There's lots of parallels, and especially today, but ever since 1950, if you ever Google Declaration of Conscience, you'll find all sorts of ways that people have tied back to that speech.
Isn't it interesting how life comes full circle
Yeah.
on these things, and you think you've kind of evolved along, beyond these things, and yet here we are.
Well, she was talking about a lot of fundamental principles in our political system, and hopefully those are enduring political principles that will always be relevant.
Yeah. She had kind of an interesting way of campaigning. You know, today it is so, well, awful is the word, really. I mean, the ads are borderline untruthful in many cases, and just trying to destroy the other person. She was, she had kind of a way that, you know, it was almost like, hey, everybody knows me, and you know, I'm not going to campaign that hard.
Well, I would say that she did campaign hard, but in an entirely different way. Her campaigns were completely antithetical to the way they're run today, which is about raising lots of money and buying lots of ads on TV.
Yeah.
And she never did that. She would not accept campaign donations. We have whole files of letters of her sending money back to people.
Wow.
She campaigned the old-fashioned way, retail politics. You went out and met people.
Yeah.
You were at the factory gates during shift changes, and at night you went to all the men's and women's groups and spoke. And that's how people knew you. And that's how you got your message out.
I wish we could go back to that.
I would prefer it. You know, I heard one of the independent candidates the other night saying that don't send me donations. Take that money and invest it in your community. You think of these millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars are being spent in Maine. Yeah, and they're for the benefit of some television stations in Maine.
But, for sure.
There's so much more that I think could be done with that money for other needs.
Frankly, this year I'd rather turn the television off. I mean, it seems like 80% of what you see in commercials is attack ads
Yeah.
on that. And during her day, that pretty much didn't. I'm sure there were some attack
No,
ads. But
it was really only, in terms of television becoming the predominant medium for getting your message out, it was really her last election in '72 where that was the way that campaigning was moving. And it's probably one of the reasons that she lost, is that she was still running the old-fashioned way and it wasn't working in this new television media age.
well, what's funny too, wasn't one of the issues her age?
Yeah.
And she was what? Maybe
She would have been 75.
5. Okay. Which we have a president who's going to be 80 very shortly. Trump is in his late 70s. You know, back then that I guess that did seem really old.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And wasn't there something too that it was almost, there's some people thought she was becoming a little detached from the area, and that
There was that
that
criticism, and another area where it raised alarms for people was about the issue of Vietnam. There were people, especially young people, who just thought she had no clue of what was really going on in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Which was that the war had spread beyond Vietnam.
Right.
There was the secret war going on in Cambodia and Laos, and where it really came to the fore was she went to speak down at Colby.
Yeah.
And when the students really started pressing her on the expansion of the war, she was sort of following the party line that no, it's just in Vietnam. And very famously, one of the students who confronted her was Brownie Carson, who went on to have
Yeah.
a career in environmentalism here in Maine, and even I think went back and served in the legislature a couple years ago. And he pointed out to her that he had just returned as a veteran from Vietnam and had been fighting. I can't remember if it was Laos or Cambodia, and that again made people question whether she really understood the issues, particularly that issue of Vietnam.
I'm sure she was very frustrated when she lost the election, but she did pick up the pieces.
She
and
did.
Came back to Skowhegan, and then just quickly, how did the whole Margaret Chase Smith library get started?
Well, she had been in Washington for over 30 years and accumulated lots of documents and needed a place for them. And there were two people who really encouraged her to start a library. One was her executive assistant, Major William Lewis,
Yes.
who had been essentially her chief of staff while she was in the Senate. And the other person, interestingly, was James Webb. And that may be a name that rings familiar to people because NASA has named a telescope after him. It's the one that's doing all these amazing photographs of the universe. Yeah. It's named after him because he was the administrator of NASA during much of the 1960s when President Kennedy says that we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him home safely by the end of the decade. It's James Webb that's put in charge of that project, the Apollo project. Yeah. And she was very close to James Webb because she had been on the Senate Aeronautical and Space Sciences Committee. And he very much admired the support and was grateful for the support that she had lent the space program during the 1960s. And he encouraged her to start the library as well. Eventually they shopped it around, and as some people may know, it was actually a university in Michigan that stepped forward and said, we'll abide by her two stipulations. One, it has to be in Skowhegan. You can't cart it off to some campus somewhere. Right. And you have to do the fundraising to build the library. Again, she wasn't going to lend her name and go out and solicit people. She wanted someone else to do the fundraising for her. Yep. And so Northwood University in Michigan agreed to those terms. She donated her collection and actually the house and the property to Northwood in 1979, and they began plans to build the library, which opened on August 26, 1982, which means we just passed the 40th anniversary of the Margaret Chase Smith Library.
Yeah. And it's a fascinating facility, too. It really is.
There's a lot here. People drive by, and when they actually come in, they're taken aback by how much is here, because from the front, it looks like sort of like a long ranch house, but when you get in, you realize how much more there's here. There's a house, there's a museum, there's a library, there's meeting spaces.
There's a lot to it. Mm-hmm. And you have research people that come here.
We do. We had one a couple weeks ago from Wichita State University. who was looking at, he's interested in the issue of gun control and what the state of it was in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, what the issue were the protests, the anti-war protests, the civil rights protests, and that's how. And then there were also coming out of the civil rights protests, there were some riots in major cities in the 1960s. So that Congress started to address the issue of gun control, and he was interested in what Margaret's stance was. He was interested in differences between approaches to gun control in rural areas versus urban areas, and men versus women. And then this week we have a researcher from Princeton University who's working on his doctoral dissertation, and he's studying Edward R. Murrow, the very famous CBS journalist from the 1950s and 40s, 50s, and 60s. And Margaret's connection to Edward R. Murrow is that when she went on her world trip in 1954 and 1955, she visited 23 countries. She interviewed world leaders along the way, and it was filmed by CBS for Murrow's television program called See It Now, which is, in some respects, the precursor to 60 Minutes.
Okay.
A lot of the people who worked with Murrow on 60 Minutes went on to start, on See It Now went on to start 60 Minutes in 1968. Most famously being Don Hewitt, who was for many years the executive producer of 60 Minutes. Yeah. And then Margaret Chase Smith worked on a book that Murrow oversaw called This I Believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she did a pretty good job interacting with the public when she was a senator. She actually wrote, was it a weekly
Yes.
newspaper article, Washington and You, I
Correct.
remember.
Good memory, Chris.
Yeah, well, I work on it a little bit. And that was during the, it was over about a 15-year
Yeah.
or longer span.
Yes, she did, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah, the other area that we see her connection to people is she spent a lot of time on what's referred to as constituent service. A lot of our collection is letters from the public to her, asking for help with situations, and her responses back to them. And the other way we see it is a lot of people who come here with stories about Margaret Chase Smith are stories about how she very directly helped them or their families.
did they have, now constituent service back then, I'm sure it was not quite the way it is today, where they have big staffs that do this stuff and various offices that do. Was Margaret personally writing letters back to people?
She would be dictating them, but there was a large pool of secretaries, and that's been one of the interesting things in the time that I've been here, is to meet some of those secretaries and for them to talk about what the office procedures were like. And they tend to, there would be a pool of secretaries, and then they'd have a certain specialty. So if it was military affairs, that would get assigned to a certain set of secretaries. And so they sort of knew what the standard response was. But one of the rules was that every single piece of correspondence had to be responded to the same day that it came in. And it may be just a very simple response to start with, saying, "We've received your letter, we're working on it." But that was one of the principles that she had, to let people know that she was responsive and aware. That way they couldn't say, "Oh, it was lost." You know?
Well, that's constituent service.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, the library has just like an amazing amount of material on Margaret Chase Smith and events in the world. And you've got like, what is it, like 300,000 documents and binders and things?
300,000 paper documents, over 500 scrapbooks. And in some ways, the scrapbooks are the most fascinating because they are newspaper articles and magazine articles, and sometimes within them you're also getting a sense of what's going on around, in the world around as well, or even just like from looking at the magazine ads as well. And then we have about 50 volumes of called her statements and speeches, which reflect just about every year that she was in public life. We have audio of her, video of her. The researcher here doing the work on Edward R. Murrow is actually today, I think he's looking at the videotapes, some of which is the raw footage. Not all of it was able to go into the actual pieces that appeared on See It Now, but he's getting to see the raw footage of the entire interview she was doing with these world leaders.
That's right. You got a bunch of tapes, a bunch of audio stuff on her career. here as well. How can the public access something like that?
Well, we are aware that more and more the world is becoming digital.
Yeah.
So more and more we're trying to digitize what we have and make it available. So there's some digital material available right on our website, mcslibrary.org. With some of it, when you get into audio and video, those are large files.
Yep.
And so they take up a lot of space. So what we're tending to do with that is we've created a YouTube channel. So you can see some historic video on our YouTube channel, which is the MCS Library.
Yeah.
Just go to YouTube and look for the MCS Library.
Okay.
You can see some interviews that we've done with people connected to the library, some of the researchers who've come, but also some historic material that we've posted there.
Now, the library, it was managed and actually owned, right, at one point
Yes.
by Northwood Institute in Michigan.
Midland, Michigan. Yeah.
And they decided at some point that that was it for them,
Yeah.
and then the University of Maine came in the picture at that
Well,
point.
what happened is Senator Smith's lawyer, a man named Mert Henry, had always foreseen the what-if scenarios.
Yeah.
And one what-if was, well, what if Northwood didn't want to run the library anymore? And so there was a provision that it had to be offered back to a foundation in Maine. All along the way, the money for the library was kept in Maine with a foundation called the Margaret Chase Smith Foundation.
Yeah.
So the money that Northwood used to run the library was coming from Maine. And so the provision was if Northwood did not want the property in the collection anymore, they had to offer it back to the foundation. So that's what happened in 2011, 2012. The foundation bought back the property, the facility, and the collection. And the foundation did not want to be running the library, so they contracted with the University of Maine to administer the Margaret Chase Smith Library. And that's been the arrangement since January 1st, 2012.
And they actually have a public policy center named after her.
They do, which it predates that relationship in 2012. I think that was sometime in the 80s or 90s that there was already a policy center there, but they named it after Margaret Chase Smith.
Okay.
And so we are under the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center at the University of Maine.
Okay. And has that
That's
been
who we report
I'm
to.
assuming that's been a good relationship.
It has.
Since then, yeah.
We always had a relationship with them because of doing public policy, and that was something very near and dear to the heart of Margaret Chase Smith. But it's just become much more formalized now that we're part of the University of Maine.
Yeah. So now that we're, I don't know if I can say we're coming out of the pandemic. Every time
we
you
are.
think we are, we've got vaccines and treatments and all that stuff, and someday we'll hopefully be rid of it altogether. But
Well, I think that's the point, is we won't. COVID is here forever. It's just
Yeah.
that we can now manage it.
yeah, that's
Like
right.
the flu is here, or the cold is here.
That's right.
COVID is here. We can just manage it, hopefully much better.
That's right. Well, I got my shot, so I hopefully that's managing it on my part, anyways.
Yeah.
The fact that you are starting to open up again, you're now doing some events, and a major event that you just did was Margaret Chase Smith Day, which is really kind of revival
It is.
of something from years ago. So take us back to the beginning, the first Margaret Chase Smith. Why did it start?
The first Margaret Chase Smith Day seems to have started here in Skowhegan to coincide with the dedication of the bridges.
Bridges.
When the bridges were first named after Margaret Chase Smith. And on that same day, they also dedicated a Margaret Chase Smith garden at Coburn Park.
Yeah.
And then over time, it's gone through different iterations. There are points where the state stepped in and they proclaimed Margaret Chase Smith Days. And it's even in the Maine statutes that there's an official Margaret Chase Smith Day. And when I first came here, which was at the end of 1996, the Skowhegan Community Action Group was still making sure that a Margaret Chase Smith Day was celebrated. When they were responsible for it, they tried to do it in the summertime when we could get more of an audience. When when SCAG started to fade away and we stepped in and took it over, we would do it in December to correspond when her birthday was, which was December 14th. And the problem we started running in there is if you do it in December, the weather, it gets very iffy. So there was a couple of years where we kept having ice storms. And so then we sort of got away from doing it. And about 2 or 3 years ago, Evelyn Bowman approached me and said, we need to have Margaret Chase Smith Day back.
That sounds like Evelyn.
It was very much Evelyn. And I thought it sort of had again fallen by the wayside as one of those things that got swept up in the whole COVID situation. How can you have a Margaret Chase Smith Day when everything's closed down? But she, as you know, Evelyn, she did not give up.
No.
As soon as things started to get somewhat back to normal, she approached me again and said, David, why don't we have a Margaret Chase Smith Day? And she was doing this under the auspices of the Skowhegan Heritage Committee or Council, whatever they call it. And so the selectmen made a proclamation, and the date we decided on was August 26th.
Which is significant
for a couple of reasons. And, for Margaret, the important days are June 1st, because that's the day she gave her Declaration of Conscience speech, and December 14th, because that's her birthday. I told you why December doesn't work very well because of the weather. June doesn't work very well for us because we're doing a lot of work with school groups at that time. So we decided to go back to August, which is when SCAG had been doing it. And we picked the 26th because, in my mind, the reason I picked it was it's called Women's Equality Day because it's the day that the 19th Amendment became officially ratified and part of the United States Constitution, and that's the amendment that gave women the right to vote. But very quickly registered with me that was also the birthday of the library.
Yes.
And so it was a very happy coincidence that August 26th, 2022 was going to be the 40th anniversary of the library. So we sort of mixed those two things together, Margaret Chase Smith Day and the 40th anniversary of the library. And one of the things I did is we had a guest register from August 26, 1982, and I went through it to see how many names I recognized. And there was about, I think, 24 people that I recognized. And I made a special point of inviting them, and it was great to have them here 40 years later. One of those people being Evelyn Bowman. But it was not only Evelyn. When she came 40 years ago, she brought her daughter, Sarah.
Yeah.
So Sarah was able to be here.
Oh, nice.
Who's now a teacher in the school system.
Nice, yeah.
There was a couple other cases of that. The Nicholsons, Gloria Nicholson had been
Bob
here,
and Gloria.
with her children 40 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. And there were several other instances where people were able to come back 40 years later.
That was nice. You had, what, 60, 75?
Yeah, we, again, because this was really the first case of us in over 2.5 years of trying to do a large public event. I was trying to guesstimate how many people might show up. And I was hoping between 50 and 75, and we wound up getting 65, so 65. Right in the middle. So that was an encouraging sign.
And from what I understand, this is going to be an annual event every year, August 26th.
Yep.
So hopefully we'll be there to see that next year.
So next year, because it's on a specific day, the day of the week will move over the course of time.
Right.
And this year it was on a Friday, but next year it'll be on a Saturday. So what we're hopeful with it being on a Saturday is that hopefully we can get more families here. One of the things we had done, we had some special programming for kids, but because it was during the day, the week before school started, we didn't get many kids here. But with it next year being on a Saturday, we're hoping we can get more families here.
And Margaret Chase Smith wanted this to be a child-friendly facility, and you have this way. You go out to the community and you invite classes of children to come here as well. Obviously, during the pandemic, that didn't work very well, but have you resumed that again? We
did. We were very pleased that this spring schools started to call us again and wanted to come back. And the last school group we had was from Williams Elementary School in March of 2020, and I think it was late March or maybe early April of 2022. Williams Elementary School from Oakland came back.
Yeah.
And we had some other schools as well. And we're already getting calls for this fall. We have Fairmount Elementary School in Bangor, that will be coming. They'll be bringing all their fourth graders. And so the last time they were here was in the fall of 2019. So it will be 3 years since they were last here.
And as part of the tour, I think I read that there's like a 20-minute video that you do on Margaret Chase Smith.
We start off with an introductory video while the kids are together. Yeah. And then we split them up into groups and rotate them through. One group will start out in the museum and do a scavenger hunt. One group will come into the house and have a tour. One group will go into the research room, and then a fourth group will either do another activity, a little more general about the time period in which Margaret lived, or depending on how much time they have, sometimes that'll be the time when they'll need to do their lunch break.
Another event that you're involved in is National History Day.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that started, in the 1970s and kind of evolved into a national thing?
It did. I think it started in Ohio, in the Cleveland, Ohio area in 1974. And from there it grew into a national organization, national event. And so it's the 50 states plus the 6 territories have programs, and students in the 6th grade through the 12th grade compete, and the winners in multiple categories and multiple age groups then go on to the national competition, which is held at the University of Maryland. So the competition, we do regional competitions here in Maine, a northern and a southern, and those will take place in March and April, and then usually either in late April or early May we'll have the state competition at the University of Maine, and then the top 2 placeholders in each category in each division are able to go down to the national competition at the University of Maryland, which is usually in June.
And this is grades 6 through 12?
6 through 12. So the 6th through 8th graders compete in the junior division, and the 9th through 12th graders compete in the senior division. And there's like 5 or 6 different categories, things like performance, documentary, exhibit, paper.
And I think, isn't there some teacher workshop here in November where they get trained on this and do exhibit building? And
so in the past we've just sort of done a very general workshop introducing them to what the History Day program is. Yeah. But this year we decided to make it more hands-on, and John Taylor, who's the state coordinator, has decided that we're going to have as many as 12 teachers here, and what we're going to have them do that day is do a little bit of research in the collection, and then out of that have them make an exhibit. Yeah. So they get this feel of what it takes to do the research, translate the research into something that you can turn into an exhibit, and then actually make an exhibit.
Good way to educate.
Yeah, learn by doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And other ways of interacting with the public, I think we've covered this a little bit. You have the Leek Shaw presentation, and what's the other one? The Maine
town meeting is usually in the springtime, usually May, or this year we did it on June 1st, again, that significant day in Margaret's career. And then the Leek Shaw Lecture on International Affairs is held in the fall, and the speaker this year, she's new to Maine. She is actually a reporter who's just started with the Bangor Daily News named Maher Sher. And she's been a journalist all around the world, and she's done reporting in Afghanistan and the Middle East, and we're doing this in conjunction with the Mid-Maine Global Forum, and their theme for the year is migration. So we're having her talk about what she's learned about refugees from Afghanistan, and by actually, again, doing reporting in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And she's also started to do some reporting on refugees from the civil war that's going on in Yemen, in the Middle East.
Right,
and we're looking to do that in December.
Okay.
We haven't selected a date yet. She said to get back in touch with her in early November, because again, she's very new to Maine, she's very new to her job, and she wanted to get her feet underneath her before she committed to a date, but we're looking at sometime in December.
And that's a Zoom event? Or?
Yes, because of her work schedule, because the Mid-Maine Global Forum does these as noontime events, it's going to work better for her schedule. to do it as a Zoom presentation.
Any other events coming up, David?
The workshop, the History Day workshop, the Leek Shaw lecture for the fall, and then we do our book group, which meets once a month, the third Tuesday of the month, both in person and via Zoom. And we just started back up again in September. And we did a book called A Man Called Uwe, which was a very popular book about 5 years ago. And the next book we're going to do is War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, written in 1898. We picked October because one of the ways that people may know that story is through the very famous radio broadcast that Orson Welles did in 1938, right before Halloween, and it scared the bejabbers out of people.
Yes, a lot of people really believed that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, our researcher here this week wrote a book about that radio broadcast, and in it he talks about why people were susceptible. One of the reasons we have to remember is that a world war was going on, and places were getting invaded.
Yeah.
Czechoslovakia had gotten invaded. Poland was about to get invaded. So that was somewhat on people's mind, and that was one of the reasons people were susceptible to believing that there might be an invasion from Mars.
And the world wasn't quite as connected back then, and they were sitting around radios listening.
Right. Well, it's interesting to read his book. He makes the point that at that point, the radio is the new medium. As you know, the internet is for us. That was for people of that day.
Yeah.
He actually has an interesting thesis in his book, which is that is one of the first examples of fake news. The radio broadcast was quite literally staged as a fake piece of news. But his other piece of it is that the way it was reported was somewhat fake, in that the media very much overblew the reaction to it, because most people did not listen to the radio broadcast. Most people that night would have been tuned in to Charlie McCarthy and Edgar Bergen.
Okay.
Interesting. The numbers that were listening to the Mercury Theater that night were very low. And there was, the people in the area in New Jersey where Orson Welles was saying the invasion was taking place, their ears perked up. But beyond the New York, New Jersey area, there were some people who got alarmed, but it was nowhere near what the newspapers led people to believe.
Well, the first of fake news, huh?
I'm sure there were other, you go back to the late 1890s and there was a whole phenomenon called yellow journalism, made famous by William Randolph Hearst family, newspapers in New York City. So, there's always been cases of sensationalizing the news. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think what we want to do now is take a little history tour.
Okay.
Here in the library, and we're gonna, anybody that comes into the library, you've got a whole line of things going chronologically down the front of the building, the hallway of the building, to see, and we don't have time to go through every item there.
Well, we want to leave things for people to actually come and see.
Yeah, you want to have people actually come here rather than just see it on TV.
We'll hit some highlights.
Okay, we'll do that and be right back. Oh, excuse me. Okay, here we are, and we're going to give you a little historical tour of Margaret Chase Smith's life through pictures. And David, let's start from the beginning.
All right. Well, we're going to give people a taste. We don't give too much away, but I always like to begin at the beginning. In 1897, when she's born, here you see baby Margaret with her mother Carrie and her father George. And they lived in a house over on North Avenue. It still stands. It's right next to the Beverage Mart. It's been on the market a couple of times during the pandemic, if anyone ever wants to own the Margaret Chase Smith house. It actually belonged to her grandfather, John Murray. I'm going to skip ahead to when she's in high school, and I mentioned this in conversation with Chris, that The Skowhegan High School class of 1916 got to go down to Washington, D.C., and that building they're posed in front of is the White House. She got to go in and meet the President of the United States, who was Woodrow Wilson. And with school kids, I always make a point of emphasizing in this year 1916 that women still didn't have the right to vote. And so it gives you a real sense of what Margaret overcame in her career to be taken seriously as a woman. When she was in high school, she wasn't the greatest student. Bill Laney found her postcard. They were cleaning out old records and they wanted to throw away the old postcards. And he took a look through because he knew it was probably around the time of Margaret. And he found her report card. Again, she wasn't a stellar student. She did well in business classes, but didn't do well in, for example, history. She almost failed history. What she really liked was sports. And if you had asked her in high school what she wanted to be, she would have said a phys ed teacher. And in particular, she played basketball. And these pictures you're seeing are of the basketball team in 1915. And after she graduated in 1916, she was the coach. And they considered themselves the state champs in 1916. The Skowhegan girls just won the state championship, and we're saying it's the first time they'd done it. First time within the context of a tournament. But the 1916 Skowhegan High School team considered themselves to be the state champions because they had beat all comers. In that mind, that made them the state champions. So her first job, her very first job out of high school was to teach school. She taught at the Pitt School in a one-room schoolhouse. She found it very difficult. Just the one teacher with all the grades blended together. Being the newest teacher, she had the worst assignment, meaning she was the farthest out of town, which meant she had to board with another family. And another difficulty she had is not all of her students spoke English. Some of them spoke French. So she only lasted 1 year as a school teacher. She worked as a telephone operator. She worked for the local newspaper in town called the Independent Reporter. And along the way, she met this gentleman right here named Clyde Smith, who was quite a bit older than her. He was 20 years older than her. He had been married once before. He was a divorcee. This is still a little bit scandalous at that time. And one of his tricks was he would call up the operator, who he knew on some occasions would be Margaret, to strike up conversations with her. He was a very successful businessman and politician, and they had that interest in politics. Margaret's inroads into politics was through women's groups, and they became quite a team. He gets himself elected to Congress in 1936, and Margaret goes down to be his personal secretary. And that becomes important because, as we talked about in our conversation, Chris, he's going to pass away in 1940, and Margaret's going to win election on her own. And as I mentioned, she served in the House for 8 years. And going in the 1940s meant she was there as World War II is starting to come about. The Germans invading Czechoslovakia and then Poland in 1938 and 1939, and even before that, the Spanish Civil War in 1936. And Clyde, I want to emphasize this point because a lot of say, oh, she just, rode in on the coattails of Clyde. But she had some different points of view than he did. He was a classic American isolationist. He believed that America just shouldn't get itself involved in the wars going on in Europe. And Margaret was very much an internationalist and believed that America should be preparing for a draft and should be selling armaments to France and England. And this all will come to the fore when Pearl Harbor is attacked in 1941. And at that point, once the war is going, being from Maine, she got herself on the House Naval Affairs Committee, which is very important because that's going to be responsible for ship contracts during World War II. And we had Bath Iron Works, and we had the Navy Yards down in Portland and South Portland, and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard as well. But another area that she was very interested in was the effects of the war on the home front. She was on a subcommittee called the Congestion Area Subcommittee, and they traveled all around the country to see what the impact was on communities. And one of the places they came to was Portland. There was lack of housing, there was lack of supervision for kids because one parent might be in the military, the other parent would be working in a military installation or a defense contractor. And this is really the first time the idea of latchkey children come about. And the other area she was interested in was what was the role of women in the military going to be. And she was very much a supporter of the units, special units within the military. The SPARS that you see here was the unit in the Coast Guard, the WAVES was the Navy, the WAFs was the Army Air Force, and the WACs was in the Army. And then after the war was over, she was very much a supporter of women being able to stay in the military, and that's what this photo is of, is President Truman signing some legislation that allowed women to stay in the military after the war as permanent members of the military. After the war is over, she was a woman of ambition, and she eventually decides that she's going to run for the United States Senate, and we talked about that in our conversation. But I always like to point out this plaque that she received when she was elected. And when you read the plaque, about halfway down, it says, "Who being duly elected by the people of his state." And so it shows you what the world was like even after the 19th Amendment is ratified, that people still aren't expecting to see women in the types of roles that Margaret Chase Smith is trying to get herself into. And so they didn't have any plaques made up in 1948 and 49 that said her state, because they weren't expecting there to be any women in the United States Senate. She served there for 24 years, and that whole time she ever served with one other woman. So mostly it was her and a body full of men. So she goes into the Senate at a very interesting time. It's after the war. It's the time when what we came to refer to as the Cold War with the Soviet Union starts. The Soviet Union explodes an atomic bomb in 1949. China invades the Chinese Civil War in 1949. The nationalist Chinese get kicked out of mainland China and go on to Taiwan. And those are still issues going on today. Almost 80 years later, what's the status of China relative to Taiwan? The Soviet Union broke up, but we may be back to a Cold War and hopefully not a hot war with the Soviet, well, it's not the Soviet Union, it's Russia now. That's one of the issues, that the Soviet Union broke apart, and Mr. Putin would like to put it back together again. And so this is a time when the senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy, came to the fore because he started to make an issue of the rise of communism, saying that these things like the Soviet Union exploding an atomic bomb and China, the Chinese communists coming to power, was because of things that our State Department was mismanaging or the Army was mismanaging, and started going around the country saying that there were communists within our government. And what raised the suspicions of Margaret Chase Smith was anytime anyone ever went to see this evidence that he said he had, it was just lots of gossip and rumor and innuendo. And he was famous for calling people before his committee and interrogating them. And when people invoked their Fifth Amendment privilege, he would insinuate that meant they were guilty, which is a subversion of the principle of the Fifth Amendment. So she decided very early on that he was just a demagogue trying to make his name for himself at the expense of other people, and decided to speak out against him in this very famous speech that she made on June 1st, 1950, called the Declaration of Conscience. She never mentions Joe McCarthy by name, but by criticizing the tactics that he was using, it was very clear who she was speaking out against. It caused a great sensation the next day all across the country. Newspapers are putting the speech in banner headlines. 11 days later, she's on the cover of Newsweek magazine, and the headline down below is Senator Smith, a woman vice president, ? So this is really the moment she gets onto the national stage, and people start seeing her as a potential vice presidential or presidential candidate someday. Margaret's approach to the rise of communism was to go out into the world and see why were people in Western Europe voting for communists in places like France and Italy, and what were the conditions in those countries of Central and Eastern Europe that had gone through the war and been devastated, and where the Soviet Union had remained in occupation. So she went on a world trip at the end of 1954 and the beginning of 1955 and visited 23 countries. This is the map that she made of the places that she visited. And we've already seen this picture of Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden that she met in England. This is an interview she did with the head of the nationalist Chinese, General Chiang Kai-shek, who lost the mainland and had to set up his government on Taiwan. And again, that's a division that still goes on today that the communist Chinese are not happy with. Here you see her in Paris, France, in front of the Eiffel Tower, being filmed by CBS television for this program I told you about, See It Now, hosted by Edward R. Murrow. Here she is in East Germany at the Brandenburg Gate. And again, you see the effects of the war. You can see how scarred the gate is, how all the soot that it has on it from the bombings during the war. And many people here in the Skowhegan area may remember 1955 was significant because later in the year, there was a visit from a president of the United States. President Dwight Eisenhower was coming to go fishing up at the Rangeley Lakes, but was coming near enough to Skowhegan that they arranged for him to stop in town and give a speech up at the fairgrounds. And then she invited the president and his entourage and the press corps out onto her back and lawn for a steak and lobster dinner catered by Tyke's restaurant.
Yes.
And she knew that the president liked golf, so she set up a little golf course. And we still have the flags and the golf clubs. And a photo of the 9th hole. And actually, I should make a pitch that the Rangeley Lakes Historical Society did an exhibit this past summer about President Eisenhower coming to visit and go fishing in 1955. And we are going to borrow it in mid-October and set it up and have it on display here till next Memorial Day. So that's something that people can come and see about that visit of President Eisenhower to Maine in 1955. And I mentioned that after the Declaration of Conscience speech, Margaret had become a national figure, in part because she became the female Republican voice of national politics. And here's an example of that. This is right before the presidential election in 1956 between President Eisenhower and the Democratic candidate was Adlai Stevenson. So Face the Nation, the Sunday morning news program on CBS, has Eleanor Roosevelt to come in and give the female Democratic point of view, and Margaret Chase Smith to give the female Republican point of view. And it's very interesting to watch this debate between Eleanor Roosevelt and Margaret Chase Smith, and to realize that Margaret Chase Smith understood the medium of television much better than Eleanor Roosevelt did. So she comes across much better during the debate, to the point about halfway through, the journalists, the panelists, stop asking Eleanor questions because they realize she rambles. And the more she rambles, the less they can ask questions. So they start directing them all towards Margaret. And here's another example of the celebrity that she had. This is her at an awards ceremony with two very famous comedians, actors of the day, Danny Kaye on her right and Jimmy Stewart on her left. Yeah. And now we will make the turn, start heading down the hallway, getting into the 1960s. And this is a time when Margaret is starting to think about running for president of the United States. Before she can do that, she has to run for re-election in 1960. And it's the first time that two women ever ran for a Senate seat. The Democrats in Maine decided that maybe the way to defeat her was by selecting a female candidate. And their candidate in that year was a woman named Lucia Cormier, who Margaret Chase Smith defeated. Another highlight in the early 60s is President John Kennedy came to Maine in 1963, October, and he came to get an honorary degree from the University of Maine at Orono. And so there's some pictures of Margaret Chase Smith with him. And this is actually the last public appearance that he made before he went to Dallas in November of 1963. So as Margaret is thinking there in the 1960s about running for president, she actually is thinking that she's going to be running against John Kennedy. And because of Kennedy's assassination and the fact that Lyndon Johnson becomes president, it was interesting in that she was very close to Lyndon Johnson. They had both come into the Senate in the same year in 1949. And Lyndon Johnson had eventually become the Senate Majority Leader. And this is at a time when, to break a filibuster, you need 2/3 of the vote. So he, as the Democratic leader, knew he was always going to need some Republican votes. So he had very much cultivated a relationship with Margaret Chase Smith. But nevertheless, she did enter into the Republican campaign that year. There were lots of candidates. We actually have an interesting cartoon right here. We'll highlight some of the major candidates. This is from February of 1964 in a newspaper, and it's right before the New Hampshire primary. At that time, the New Hampshire primary was in March. New Hampshire wants to be first, so they backed it all the way up to January so they can still be the first primary. And what the cartoonist was playing off of was that in February of 1964, on the Ed Sullivan Show, a new musical group from England had appeared, the Beatles. So they titled this cartoon, "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and they had turned John, Paul, George, and Ringo into Dickie, Richard Nixon, Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, Rocky, Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, and then Maggie is Margaret Chase Smith. And the two major candidates were Barry Goldwater, who was very conservative, and Nelson Rockefeller, who was considered a moderate to liberal Republican. And Margaret thought there needed to be someone in between those two poles, and that's why she and a lot of other moderates came into the race. And she took her candidacy all the way to the convention in San Francisco that year, and she eventually wound up coming in second to Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee that year. But that was her foray into running for President of the United States. Another interesting thing that she did during her career, I alluded to this, that she served on the Aeronautical and Space Sciences Committee. That's where she got to know James Webb, the administrator of NASA during the 1960s. And one of the things that she was very proud of is ways that Maine could be involved in the space program. One of the ways is through a satellite called Telstar, which was the first communications satellite. And there was one base in England, one base in France, and there was a base in the United States, and it was in Maine. It was in Andover, Maine. Some of you may know that the high school in Bethel is called Telstar High School.
Yes.
They picked Andover, Maine because it's surrounded by mountains. So essentially it made it a bowl. It's a very isolated area, so there wouldn't be interference. You didn't want other signals interfering with what was being downloaded from Telstar. Some other ways that Maine was involved in the space program is that there was a member of the Air Force from Madison named Robert Rushworth, and the Air Force had astronauts in their mind that flew the X-15s. The Air Force's definition was, I think, that you had to just fly over like 100,000 feet into the air. So about 20 miles. So long as you went 20 miles, they considered you an astronaut. NASA has a different definition. So NASA didn't necessarily consider these astronauts, but the Air Force did. They called them fixed wing astronauts. So there's Major Rushworth, and I believe the auditorium over at Madison is the gym is called the Rushworth Gymnasium. Yeah.
Yep.
And then another interesting way is this disc right here is one that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin left on the surface of the moon. And what it has etched into it with a laser is letters and messages from world leaders, President of the United States and other world leaders. And then there's also a letter from the Aeronautical and Space Sciences Committee, which has Margaret's name on it. So there is a disc like this up on the moon with her name on it. And one of the reasons she was proud of it, not just that her name was on it, the company that did the etching was a company from Maine called Sprague Electrical, which I think has been bought out over time, but that was another thing she was proud of. One of my favorite stories about how she tried to get Maine involved in the space program is someone came up with an experiment to see how potatoes functioned in space. and playing off of the Russian satellite Sputnik. They called it Spudnik, S-P-U-D. One other thing I want to make sure to highlight here that we're proud of in the museum is for her many years of service, Margaret Chase Smith received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1989. She received it from President George H.W. Bush for her over 30 years of public service. It's the highest honor that a civilian can receive in the United States, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And Chris very kindly today brought another honor that traces back to George H.W. Bush, which I don't know if you want to tell the story, Chris, of what you were able to bring today.
Well, yeah, it's a license plate, a commemorative license plate from 1989, and it is the 200th presidential inaugural event. And this was to have been delivered to Margaret Chase Smith in 1989. Unfortunately, it was not. But I was fortunate to come across it, and I brought it to the library today, and David's going to show it to you.
Look, we have it here.
And this was sent to Margaret from George H.W. Bush, 1989 inaugural. So there you are.
Very pleased to add it to the collection.
Yeah, we were only 33 years late, but I finally got it.
Better late than never.
Yep.
And this is the section where we'll probably go on display. This is where we tend to put new, interesting items that come into the collection. We pretty much think after all these years, we've seen everything.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, someone turns up something we haven't seen before. This is literally one of a kind.
Yes.
Or actually, two of a kind, one for the front, one for the back.
And it's actually a little letter that goes with it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for doing that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. I think we have done our little historical tour. And we've had a really fascinating interview with David Richards, who is the director of the Margaret Chase Smith Library. And David, we hope to do this again with you sometime soon. I mean, we were probably, last time we did one was roughly about 4 years ago, I think. And, in studio. Yeah. And unfortunately, pandemics tend to get in your way. So It has been a while since we've done it. But we hope to have you on again, and thank you very much. And now you know.